Picture this. You are freezing half to death on a rickety wooden watchtower on the eastern edge of the Kievan Rus. It is the dead of winter. The wind blowing off the endless steppe feels like jagged glass scraping against your face. You rub your hands together, desperately trying to force blood back into your numb fingers. You stare out into the white abyss, waiting for your shift to end. Then the wood beneath your boots begins to vibrate. At first, you think it is a tremor deep in the earth, but earthquakes do not maintain a steady, terrifying rhythm. Earthquakes do not howl. You squint into the freezing mist and see a dark, bruised stain spreading across the horizon. It is a storm of dust and snow, moving faster than any army you have ever seen. You are not looking at a military formation. You are looking at a natural disaster made of flesh, bone, and composite bows. This is the vanguard of the Mongol Empire. They have not come to conquer your city. They have come to erase it from the surface of the earth. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. For centuries, the lords of Europe have been playing a polite game they call war. They fight over tiny, insignificant patches of mud bound by a romantic delusion called chivalry. Their battles are incredibly slow, highly choreographed, and shockingly small. A few hundred knights, clad in ridiculously expensive steel armor, crash into each other, take a few noble prisoners, negotiate a handsome ransom, and ride back to their castles in time for the autumn harvest. The kings of the West genuinely believe this is the pinnacle of military strategy. They sit in their stone fortresses, completely unaware that their entire concept of warfare is about to be rendered violently obsolete. Out on the harsh, unforgiving Asian steppes, a completely different breed of violence has been perfected. It is not a gentleman's game. It is a merciless, industrial slaughterhouse fueled by horseblood and absolute meritocracy. Genghis Khan took a collection of scattered nomadic tribes and hammered them into an apocalyptic weapon. By the time his successors turn their hungry eyes toward the green pastures of Europe, the Mongol war machine has already burned its way through China, pulverized the massive Khwarezmian Empire, and turned some of the wealthiest cities in the world into flat, empty graveyards. The Mongols do not care about your royal bloodline. They do not care about the Pope in Rome. They only respect mathematics, lethal efficiency, and total, unconditional submission. The year is 1236, and the storm is finally breaking over the European frontier. The vast Mongol army, directed by the supreme ruler Ogedei Khan and commanded by the terrifying military architect Subutai, is revving its engines. Yet the European monarchs are entirely blind to the impending doom. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor are far too busy engaging in a petty, egotistical death match over political supremacy. The kings of Hungary and Poland feel completely secure behind their high stone walls and their legions of heavy cavalry. They look at their iron armor and see invincibility. They are about to discover that iron is just a very heavy metal to drag you down to the bottom of a river. The Mongols bring a terrifying alien philosophy to the continent. They do not march. They flow across the landscape like a dark, relentless tide. Every single warrior rides with a string of remounts, switching horses at a full gallop, eating raw meat tenderized beneath their saddles, and moving at a speed that European generals consider biologically impossible. They use psychological terror as their primary weapon, breaking the minds of their enemies long before the first arrow is fired. When the first desperate rumors reach the courts of Europe about a demon horde pouring out of the underworld, the arrogant nobles laugh. They assume it is just a disorganized mob of filthy, uneducated barbarians who will shatter against the might of Christian knights. That blinding arrogance will soon cost millions of lives as the European frontier transforms into a sprawling, blood-soaked kill zone. The year is 1237. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe from this time, you will see a sprawling, interconnected network of prosperous principalities known as the Kievan Rus. They are wealthy, fiercely proud, and bitterly divided. The princes of the Rus spend their days squabbling over minor trade routes and insulting each other at lavish banquets. They hear distant, troubling rumors of a massive army gathering on the edge of the civilized world, led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis. But the princes are paralyzed by their own petty politics and staggering arrogance. When the Mongol emissaries arrive at the gates of Ryazan, calmly demanding the standard tribute of 1/10 of everything, wealth, horses, and people, the Prince of Ryazan gives a famously defiant answer: "When we are dead, you can have it all." It sounds like a heroic line of dialogue in a Hollywood movie. In reality, it is the most catastrophic diplomatic failure in Eastern European history. The Mongols do not negotiate, they do not issue second warnings, and they certainly do not respect romantic displays of bravery. Batu Khan simply nods, turns his horse around, and unleashes absolute hell. The siege of Ryazan does not look like traditional European warfare. It looks like an industrial demolition project. The Mongols do not bother trying to starve the city out over agonizing months. Instead, they build a massive wooden palisade around the entire city in a matter of days, trapping everyone inside like rats in a barrel. Then the sky turns completely black, not with arrows, but with fire, massive boulders, and exploding ceramic pots filled with boiling naphtha. The Mongols have absorbed the elite siege engineers of China and Persia, turning the destruction of high stone walls into a cold, precise mathematical formula. Within 5 agonizing days, the defenses of Ryazan are pulverized. What happens next is not a battle, it is an extermination. The Mongols pour through the breached walls and massacre the population with a systematic efficiency that defies belief. They do not just kill the armed soldiers, they slaughter the women, the children, the priests hiding in the churches, and the dogs in the streets. They burn the city to its foundations, leaving nothing but a smoking, blood-soaked scar on the earth. This is the Mongol method. Extreme terror is not a byproduct of their conquests, it is their primary weapon. By utterly obliterating the first city that dares to resist, they send a psychological shockwave across the continent. But the surviving princes of the Rus still do not understand the magnitude of the threat. They try to fight the Mongols in open battle, bringing their heavy cavalry against the lightning-fast horse archers of the steppe. The result is always the same. The Rus are surrounded, peppered with armor-piercing arrows and carved into bloody pieces. By 1240, the Mongol war machine reaches the undisputed crown jewel of the region, Kiev. It is one of the magnificent cities of Europe, boasting golden domes and impenetrable fortifications. But to Subutai, the brilliant, one-eyed Mongol strategist orchestrating the campaign, Kiev is just another math problem. The noise of the Mongol army surrounding the city is so deafening, the grinding of wooden axles, the roaring of thousands of horses, the rhythmic beating of massive war drums, that the terrified people inside cannot even hear each other speak. The siege is brutally short. Mongol catapults batter the ancient walls until they simply crumble into dust. When the city falls, the slaughter is so complete that a papal envoy traveling through the desolate area several years later reports seeing nothing but countless human skulls and bleached bones scattered across the plains. Kiev, a thriving metropolis, is reduced to a rotting ghost town of barely 200 survivors. The Kievan Rus is gone. It hasn't just been defeated, it has been aggressively deleted from the map. And this is when the true suffocating panic begins to infect the West. Traumatized refugees stumble across the borders into Hungary and Poland, carrying stories that sound less like military reports and more like apocalyptic prophecies. The European kings listen to these broken survivors with mounting dread. They realize far too late that their eastern buffer zone has vanished. The monster is right at their doorstep. It is covered in the blood of their neighbors, and it is looking directly at them. The year is 1241. You are standing on a muddy field near the town of Legnica in Poland. Around you is the absolute pinnacle of European military power. Duke Henry the Pious has assembled a massive coalition of heavily armored knights, including the legendary Teutonic Order and the Knights Templar. They are sitting atop massive warhorses encased in thousands of pounds of gleaming expensive iron. They look at the sky and thank God for their impending victory. They look across the field at the Mongol detachment led by Baidar, and they see a ragged line of men in leather armor riding puny, unarmored ponies. To the European nobility, this is not a battle, it is pest control. They genuinely believe their superior European, steel and righteous Christian fury will sweep the pagan horde off the map in a single, glorious cavalry charge. Duke Henry gives the order. The trumpets sound, and thousands of tons of heavy cavalry begin to thunder across the earth. The ground shakes. The wall of iron picks up speed, leveling their lances, preparing for the crushing impact. But the impact never comes. Instead of standing their ground to be impaled, the Mongol center suddenly breaks and flees in absolute panic. To the knights, this makes perfect sense. Of course, the barbarians are running. How could they possibly stand against the flower of European chivalry? The knights cheer. They spur their horses faster, eager to run down the cowards and claim the glory. But in doing so, they commit the ultimate sin of warfare. They break their formation. They leave their slow-moving infantry far behind, strung out in a disorganized, breathless mob. They do not realize they are not chasing a fleeing enemy. They are chasing a ghost. They are running face first into the signature Mongol tactic, the feigned retreat. Suddenly, the fleeing Mongols seamlessly wheel their horses around in perfect, terrifying unison. They are not panicked. They are executing a maneuver they have practiced since they were toddlers. Before the exhausted, heavy knights can even slow their charging horses, the trap snaps shut. Mongol heavy cavalry, which the Europeans did not even know existed, crashes into their flanks. But the true nightmare comes from the sky. The Europeans suddenly find themselves engulfed in a thick, foul-smelling smoke. The Mongols have ignited chemical burners, deploying an early form of poison gas and smoke screens to completely blind the Christian army. The knights cannot see each other. They cannot hear orders over the deafening roar of Mongol kettle drums. They are trapped in a suffocating grey void, completely separated from their infantry support. And then the arrows fall, not a few stray shots, but a dense, uninterrupted mechanical blizzard of armor-piercing arrows. A Mongol composite bow has the draw weight to punch a steel-tipped arrow straight through a knight's chainmail and into his organs. The expensive iron armor, the pride of the European nobility, suddenly becomes a cage. When a knight's horse is shot out from under him, he crashes into the mud, weighed down by 60 pounds of metal. He cannot stand up fast enough. He is pinned to the ground like a helpless turtle, waiting for a Mongol soldier to walk up and casually drive a hook or a dagger through the visor of his helmet. It is not a battle, it is an abattoir. The cream of European chivalry is butchered in the mud without ever striking a meaningful blow. The terrifying legends of the Teutonic Knights mean absolutely nothing against the cold, calculated physics of Mongol warfare. When the smoke finally clears, The field is a carpet of dead men and screaming horses. Duke Henry the Pious tries to flee, but he is run down, captured, and forced to kneel in the dirt. A Mongol sword cleanly severs his head. The Mongols do not stop to celebrate. They are accountants of death. They walk through the sea of corpses, cutting one ear off every dead European to tally the body count. They fill 9 massive sacks with ears. They put Henry's severed head on the tip of a spear and parade it in front of the nearby walled city, a bloody warning to the rest of the continent. The impenetrable iron shield of Europe has not just been broken, it has been laughed at. The year is 1241. King Bela IV of Hungary believes he is the smartest man in Europe. He has heard the horrific reports of the Polish forces being annihilated at Legnica, and he has decided not to make the same mistake. He will not charge blindly into an open field. Instead, he marches his massive, well-equipped army of 80,000 men to the banks of the Sajo River. He crosses the only stone bridge, parks his forces on the western side, and builds a heavily fortified camp out of chained wagons and heavy timber. He thinks he has created an impenetrable medieval fortress. He looks at his wall of wagons and smiles. He thinks he has blocked the Mongols from crossing the river. He doesn't realize he has just built his own coffin. On the opposite bank, Subutai, the cold, calculating mastermind of the Mongol war machine, looks at the Hungarian camp and sees a glaring, fatal error. He doesn't see a fortress, he sees a crowded, inescapable kill box. The Hungarians have packed thousands of men and horses into a tight, confined space, completely neutralizing their own mobility. Subutai decides to give them a brutal lesson in advanced siege warfare, right in the middle of an open battlefield. In the dead of night, the Mongol vanguard launches a loud, violent assault on the stone bridge. The Hungarians fight back fiercely, feeling vindicated in their defensive strategy. They cheer as they hold the line. But this frontal assault is nothing more than a noisy distraction. Downriver, in the pitch black of the freezing night, Subutai is doing the impossible. He is quietly building a pontoon bridge across the deep waters of the Sajo River. He is moving tens of thousands of horses and men across the water without making a single sound. As the sun rises, the Hungarians realize the absolute horror of their situation. The Mongols are not just in front of them, they are behind them, on their flanks, completely surrounding the wagon fort in a ring of steel. And then the true nightmare begins. Subutai does not order his men to charge the wagons. That would cost Mongol lives. Instead, he orders his siege engineers forward. The Mongols have brought something the Europeans have never seen in a field battle: heavy artillery. Massive stone throwers and catapults are assembled with terrifying speed. But they are not just throwing rocks, they are launching exploding pots filled with Chinese gunpowder, naphtha, and primitive chemical weapons. Suddenly, the sky above the Hungarian camp explodes. Thunderous cracks echo across the valley as burning chemicals rain down on the densely packed knights and their terrified horses. The wagon fort turns into a blazing, inescapable furnace. Men are burned alive in their expensive armor, literally cooking inside the steel plates they thought would protect them. The screaming of thousands of trapped, burning horses is a sound that will haunt the survivors forever. The impenetrable fortress is now a roaring oven. Panic erupts. The discipline of the European army evaporates in seconds. The Hungarian soldiers desperately push against their own locked wagons to escape the toxic black smoke and flames. They pour out of the camp, expecting to be slaughtered in a desperate last stand. But Subutai knows that a cornered enemy will fight to the death, and fighting to the death is mathematically inefficient. So he leaves a deliberate, glaring gap in his siege lines, an open road leading directly west, back towards safety. The Hungarians see the gap. It looks like a miracle, a gift from God. They drop their heavy weapons and break for it. The army disintegrates into a chaotic, terrified mob running for their lives. This is exactly what the Mongols wanted. The golden rule of the steppe is simple. Never fight a man willing to die. Let him run and kill him when he is exhausted. The Mongols wait patiently until the Hungarians are strung out in a disorganized line stretching for miles. Then the hunting horns sound. The Mongol-like cavalry rides parallel to the fleeing men, shooting them down at their leisure. They fire volley after volley into the concentrated mass of terrified soldiers. For 3 agonizing days they slaughter the fleeing army, turning the road back to the capital into a 30-mile-long carpet of rotting corpses. Over 60,000 European soldiers are systematically wiped from existence. King Bela IV barely escapes with his life, ditching his royal regalia and fleeing toward the Adriatic coast like a hunted animal. The great meat grinder of the Sarjo River has consumed the final major army of Eastern Europe. The gates to the west are now violently wide open. The calendar bleeds into the late winter of 1241. The surviving monarchs of Western Europe are clutching their rosaries and staring at the mighty Danube River. This massive, deep and treacherous body of water is the only thing standing between the apocalyptic Mongol horde and the soft, undefended underbelly of the Holy Roman Empire. To the kings of the West, the river is a godsend. It is an insurmountable physical barrier. Furthermore, the brutal European winter has finally arrived. According to the civilized, comfortable rules of medieval warfare, winter means everyone packs up their swords, goes home, and waits for the spring thaw. The Europeans take a deep, collective breath. They genuinely believe the freezing temperatures have bought them a few months of precious borrowed time. They are catastrophically wrong. They are projecting their own limitations onto an enemy that defies the laws of nature. To the European nobility, winter is a reason to huddle around a roaring fireplace and drink spiced wine. To the Mongol war machine, winter is a tactical advantage. These men were born on the frozen, wind-blasted steppes of Asia, where the temperature regularly drops so low that human breath turns to ice in the air. They do not go into winter quarters. They do not stop their campaign because of a little snow. In fact, Batu Khan and his brilliant architect of death, Subutai, are sitting on the eastern bank of the Danube, patiently watching the water, waiting for the temperature to drop even further. They are not looking for a place to build boats. They are waiting for the river to build them a bridge. By January of 1242, the temperature plummets to record lows. The mighty Danube, the great protector of the West, begins to slow down. Then it turns completely solid. It becomes a thick, impenetrable sheet of ice. But Subutai is a man of science, not blind faith. He does not simply march his army onto the frozen river and hope for the best. To test the thickness and structural integrity of the ice, he executes a brilliantly cruel psychological trick. He orders his soldiers to herd captured livestock out onto the frozen surface and simply leave them there. On the opposite bank, the starving, terrified European refugees see the abandoned animals. Driven mad by hunger, they cautiously creep out onto the ice to steal the livestock. Subutai watches in silence. When he sees that the ice easily holds the weight of a struggling crowd of humans and heavy animals without cracking, he smiles. The math is confirmed. The bridge is ready. The European scouts standing watch on the western bank realize with stomach-churning horror what is about to happen. They watch as the Mongols casually lead their horses onto the frozen surface. The Mongols do not charge wildly across the ice in a disorganized panic. They are terrifyingly methodical. They wrap the hooves of their sturdy steppe ponies in thick cloth and leather to prevent them from slipping. And then, the great migration of death begins. It is a sight that shatters the sanity of the men watching. Tens of thousands of horsemen moving in an eerie, disciplined silence across the frozen water. The river that was supposed to save Europe has betrayed them. It has transformed into a massive, multi-lane highway, delivering the apocalypse directly to their doorstep. The natural defenses of the continent have been entirely bypassed by a shift in the weather. Once the Mongols cross the Danube, the psychological collapse of the West is complete. There is no longer a buffer zone. There are no more heavily fortified proxy armies to absorb the blow. The Mongols have crossed into the immediate vicinity of Vienna. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who had spent the last decade fighting with the Pope over political supremacy, is suddenly forced to look the devil in the eye. The Pope in Rome is now frantically writing letters, begging for a unified Christian defense that no longer exists. The impenetrable Iron Knights are already rotting in the mud of Poland and Hungary. The great rivers have been turned into pavement. Subutai's scouts are already probing the outskirts of Vienna, burning villages and sending a clear, unavoidable message. The butcher's bill is coming due, and there is absolutely nothing left standing in the way of the blade. The continent braces for total annihilation. The European monarchs huddling in their castles share a comforting, pathetic delusion. They convince themselves that this devastation is simply the work of mindless, rabid barbarians. They imagine a swarm of uneducated locusts that relies purely on overwhelming numbers to win. It is a lie they tell themselves to protect their fragile egos. The terrifying truth is that the Mongol war machine currently burning its way through their lands is significantly smaller than the combined armies of Europe. They are not winning through sheer mass. They are winning because they are being orchestrated by a single, terrifyingly brilliant mind. His name is Subutai, and he is the greatest military architect the world has ever seen. Subutai is not a prince. He does not have a drop of royal blood in his veins. In the rigid, class-obsessed hierarchy of 13th century Europe, a man of his birth would be incredibly lucky to spend his life grooming horses for a minor, insignificant lord. He is the son of a lowly blacksmith, but Genghis Khan did not build an empire on the delicate sensibilities of noble birth. He built it on a ruthless, bloody meritocracy. Subutai rose from a humble leather tent to command the most lethal military force on the planet simply because he was vastly better at killing people than anyone else alive. By the time he reaches the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, he has already conquered 32 distinct nations and won 65 pitched battles. He is not a brawny warrior swinging a sword in the mud. In fact, by this point in his life, he is blind in one eye and so heavily overweight that he cannot even ride a horse. He commands his apocalyptic campaigns from a specialized iron chariot. He is pure, unadulterated intellect, wrapped in a cloak of absolute ruthlessness. While European generals are busy practicing jousting and memorizing the romanticized rules of chivalry, Subutai is busy inventing modern military intelligence. Years before the first Mongol arrow is ever fired into European soil, Subutai sends vast networks of spies, heavily disguised as merchants and diplomats, deep into the West. They do not just draw simple maps of the roads and rivers, they map the psychological landscape. Subutai knows everything about his enemies. He knows about the bitter, exhausting feud between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. He knows exactly how many men the King of Hungary can muster, and he knows exactly how arrogant and impulsive the Polish nobility is. He understands his enemies far better than they understand themselves, and he uses their own political fractures to paralyze them from the inside out. His true, terrifying genius lies in his manipulation of time and space. During the invasion of Eastern Europe, Subutai deliberately divides his forces into multiple, highly mobile columns, separated by hundreds of miles of dense forests and hostile territory. To a European commander, splitting an army is a recipe for catastrophic defeat, because their communication is limited to a man on a horse shouting vague orders. Subutai operates on a completely different frequency. He utilizes a highly advanced system of colored flags, directional arrows, and the yam, a hyper-efficient network of relay riders. These desperate couriers bind their torsos tightly with heavy cloth to prevent their internal organs from rupturing as they ride horses to the point of literal exhaustion, switching mounts seamlessly to deliver battlefield intelligence. Through this brutal logistical web, Subutai synchronizes the movements of tens of thousands of men across a continent with the cold precision of a ticking clock. When the heavy European armies march out to face one Mongol column, they suddenly find themselves flanked by two more that seemingly materialize out of thin air. Subutai uses his armies not as blunt instruments, but as fluid, interconnected parts of a massive killing machine. He dictates the terms of every single engagement. He chooses the battlefield, he controls the tempo, and he flawlessly executes complex maneuvers over distances that completely boggle the medieval mind. The European knights are playing checkers, moving in slow, predictable straight lines. Subutai is playing three-dimensional chess, anticipating their moves days in advance and moving his pieces into position to guarantee their total annihilation before the battle even begins. He does not fight for glory. To him, the armored knights of Europe are simply variables in a mathematical equation, and Subutai's equations always end in zero. As he sits in his iron chariot staring at the map of the trembling continent, he is already calculating the exact angles needed to burn Vienna, sack Rome, and push the Mongol borders all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The year bleeds into the spring of 1242. The Holy Roman Empire is holding its collective breath, waiting for the end of the world. The blade of the Mongol war machine is resting squarely against the throat of Vienna. All of Europe is now just a chaotic mess of desperate refugees and trembling kings praying for a miracle. They do not realize that their miracle is currently galloping toward them, not on the glowing wings of an angel, but on the back of an exhausted, foam-flecked steppe pony ridden by a lone Mongol courier. This messenger has just ridden over 4,000 miles from the capital city of Karakorum, deep in the heart of Asia. He carries a message that will completely rewrite the trajectory of human history, and this message has absolutely nothing to do with military tactics, divine intervention, or European bravery. It has to do with a liver, thousands of miles to the east at the epicenter of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Ogedei Khan is dead. He was the supreme ruler of the planet, a man who held the absolute power of life and death over millions, from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the frozen banks of the Danube. But Ogedei did not die on a glorious battlefield with a sword in his hand. He was not brought down by a complex, shadowy political assassination. The entity that finally managed to kill the invincible Great Khan was incredibly cheap and utterly mundane: alcohol. Ogedei Khan was a catastrophic alcoholic. Despite the desperate warnings of his physicians and family, he drank until his massive biological engine simply gave out. During one of his legendary days-long drinking binges, the internal organs of the most powerful man on earth suffered total system failure. The death of his liver sent a geopolitical shockwave across the globe. For the Europeans waiting to be slaughtered, this event is the ultimate, cruel irony of history. The entirety of Western civilization, with its proud, heavily armored knights, its impenetrable stone castles, and its wealthy, commanding popes, had been utterly powerless to stop the Mongol advance. They had been crushed, burned alive, and systematically butchered like sheep in an industrial slaughterhouse. The The iron pride of Europe was buried in mass graves. Yet the one thing that ultimately saved them from total extinction, the one thing that preserved the foundation for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, was the unchecked binge drinking of a man on the other side of the world. A failing cirrhotic liver in Asia became the strongest shield the West ever had. But the lone courier carrying this news does not bring a message of liberation. He brings an absolute, terrifying directive. When the news finally reaches Batu Khan and Subutai on the European front lines, the massive war machine currently revving its engines to tear the rest of the continent apart suddenly grinds to a halt. According to the Yasa, the supreme, unbreakable legal code dictated by Genghis Khan himself, the death of a great Khan overrides everything. It mandates that all generals and royal descendants, no matter where they are on the planet, no matter what bloody campaign they are currently executing, must immediately cease all military operations. They are legally required to pack up their camps and return to the Mongolian homeland to participate in the Kurultai, the mandatory political council that will elect the next supreme leader. The monarchs of Europe know absolutely none of this. They are collapsing on the floors of their cathedrals, whipping their own backs in frantic repentance, fully believing that the final judgment has arrived. They have no idea that a tiny scrap of paper carrying bad news from Karakorum has just accomplished what the combined military might of the Western world could not. It has ordered the apocalypse to turn around. The year is 1242. The advanced scouts of the Mongol war machine are already setting fire to the outer suburbs of Vienna. The Holy Roman Empire is essentially a deer caught in the headlights of an apocalyptic juggernaut. There is no grand coalition marching to save them. The Pope and Emperor Frederick II are still bitterly ignoring the crisis, prioritizing their petty political soap opera over the literal end of the world. The citizens of Western Europe are locking their doors, digging their own graves and waiting for the screaming to start. And then the screaming never starts. Instead, a lone rider arrives at the command tent of Batu Khan on the frozen banks of the Danube. He is completely covered in dust, ice, and dried horse sweat. He delivers a single piece of news, and just like that, the invisible hand of Genghis Khan reaches out from the grave and grabs the collar of the most destructive military force in human history. According to the Yasa, the absolute and unforgiving legal code written by Genghis Khan himself, the death of the Great Khan supersedes everything. It does not matter if you are one day away from conquering the richest, softest cities in Europe. It does not matter if your enemies are currently on their knees, paralyzed by terror. When the throne in Karakorum is empty, every single prince of the royal bloodline must immediately drop his weapons, pack up his camp, and ride 4,000 miles back to the Mongolian steppe. They must attend the Kurultai, the mandatory political council, to elect the next supreme leader of the empire. To Batu Khan, this order is an agonizing, bitter pill to swallow. He can practically smell the gold stacked inside the cathedrals of Rome and Vienna. He holds the fragile throat of Europe in his hand, and all he has to do is squeeze. But the Yasa is the Yasa. To disobey the sacred law of the steppe is to invite immediate execution and civil war. So, Subutai, the cold, calculating architect of this entire continental massacre, begins to issue a series of baffling orders. The siege engines are quietly dismantled. The forward scouting parties are recalled from the Austrian borders. The massive herds of stolen livestock are turned around. The Mongols do not flee. They do not look like a defeated army running in panic. They pack up their gear with the exact same terrifying mechanical efficiency they use to burn down cities. They mount their horses, turn their backs on the undefended riches of the West, and simply begin riding east. Imagine the psychological whiplash of the European defenders. You are standing on a freezing castle wall, gripping a spear, sweating through your tunic, waiting to be violently butchered by an invincible alien army. You blink, and the army is just leaving. They are casually trotting away, driving their sheep and tens of thousands of weeping captives ahead of them, slowly vanishing into the eastern horizon. The silence that falls over Europe is deafening and deeply paranoid. At first, the monarchs suspect a trap. They think it is another one of Subutai's brilliant, cruel, feigned retreats. They refuse to leave their stone fortresses for weeks, absolutely convinced that the moment they step outside, a cloud of armor-piercing arrows will blot out the sun, but the horizon remains empty. The smoke from the burning villages slowly clears. The demons have actually packed up and gone home. The kings and popes of the West quickly try to spin this massive stroke of blind, impossible luck into a theological victory. They declare that their fervent prayers have been answered. They claim that God himself has intervened to shield the righteous Christian kingdoms from the pagan horde. They throw lavish feasts, ring the church bells, and celebrate their divine salvation. They are completely oblivious to the pathetic truth. They were not saved by a sudden surge of European bravery, nor by divine intervention. They were saved by ancient Mongolian inheritance laws and a dead man's failing liver. The great, arrogant monarchs of Europe are completely unaware that their continued existence, the heavy crowns on their heads, and the future of their entire civilization are merely a bureaucratic byproduct of a political transition happening on the other side of the planet. The year is 1242. Across the surviving cities of Western Europe, cathedral bells are ringing until the heavy hemp ropes snap. Men who spent the last 6 months hiding in damp cellars, weeping in absolute terror, are now suddenly puffing out their chests and declaring a holy victory. They look at the retreating dust clouds of the Mongol horde and desperately convince themselves that their fervent prayers have summoned an invisible shield of divine protection. The Pope issues triumphant letters. The monarchs pat themselves on the back, commissioning grand tapestries and songs. They are aggressively writing a fictional narrative of European resilience to cover up the humiliating fact that they were entirely, hopelessly outmatched. They do not realize they are celebrating a clerical error in the apocalypse. Now, to be fair to the mechanics of history, the death of Ogedei Khan was the primary, non-negotiable trigger for the Great Withdrawal, but the European environment was also quietly betraying the Mongol war machine. As the spring of 1242 arrives, it brings relentless torrential rain. The Great Hungarian plains, which the Mongols had initially viewed as a perfect, flat extension of the Asian steppe, turn into a massive, suffocating ocean of mud. You must remember that the Mongol army is a biological engine fueled entirely by grass. Every single warrior requires a string of at least 4 to 5 remounts to maintain their terrifying speed. That is hundreds of thousands of horses that need to eat huge quantities of forage every single day. But the freezing, unusually wet spring stunts the growth of the pastures. The grass rots before it can be properly grazed. The heavily armored war horses of the European knights might be famously useless in a swamp, but the nimble steppe ponies of the Mongols are suddenly facing mass starvation. Furthermore, dragging heavy siege engines and looted treasure through 3 feet of thick, sucking mud is a logistical nightmare even for a genius like Subutai. The pristine, high-speed mathematical warfare that the Mongols rely on is bogging down. It is a frustrating inconvenience, but make no mistake, it is only an inconvenience. Subutai is a man who builds pontoon bridges across freezing rivers in the dead of night and coordinates armies across mountain ranges. A little mud would not have saved Europe. Subutai had already dispatched his elite scouts deep into Austria and along the borders of Germany. He had mapped the roads to the Atlantic Ocean. He was simply resting his horses and waiting for the ground to dry. The mud was a temporary friction. The yasa, the law of the Khan, was an absolute command. When the courier arrived with the news of Ogedei's death, Subutai must have stared westward with cold, bitter frustration. He held the throat of an entire civilization in his hand, and he was politically forced to let go. When you strip away the religious propaganda, the Great Withdrawal reveals the terrifying, razor-thin fragility of human history. Everything that the West will eventually become, the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all of it is predicated on the simple fact that the Mongols turned around in 1242. If Ogedei Khan had been a moderate drinker, if his liver had held out for just 12 more months, the trajectory of the planet would be violently unrecognizable. Subutai's meticulously calculated blueprints for the invasion of the Holy Roman Empire would have been ruthlessly executed. Vienna would have been burned to the foundation. The great blossoming universities of Paris and Bologna would have been reduced to smouldering ash. Rome would have been systematically sacked, its monumental architecture dismantled, and the Pope likely rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, as the Mongols preferred not to spill the blood of kings and priests. The emerging democratic institutions, the Magna Carta, the very DNA of Western philosophy, would have been extinguished. Europe would have become just another peripheral, devastated, tribute-paying province at the edge of a massive Asian empire. The kings of Europe build their grand monuments to survival, completely blind to the agonizing truth. Their entire future was accidentally purchased by a drunken man dying 4,000 miles away. The year is 1243. The dust has finally settled over the ruins of Eastern Europe, but the continent is not breathing a sigh of relief. It is holding its breath. The Mongol war machine has vanished back into the endless expanse of the Asian steppe, leaving behind a silence that is far more terrifying than the deafening roar of their kettle drums. The kings of the West are suffering from a collective, continent-wide case of post-traumatic stress. Every time the wind howls from the east, every time a cloud of dust rises on the horizon, the monarchs of Europe reach for their swords in a blind panic. They know the truth they refuse to admit in public. The monster is not dead. It is simply resting. This paralyzing fear fundamentally rewrites the DNA of European civilization. Before 1241, a European king felt secure behind a wooden palisade or a thin stone wall. After 1241, the continent descends into an architectural frenzy born of absolute paranoia. King Bela IV of Hungary, the man who barely escaped the meat grinder of the Sajo River, spends the rest of his reign frantically turning his kingdom into a fortress. He realizes that the Mongols swept over wooden defenses like a wildfire, but they briefly stalled at heavy stone. He completely overhauls the defensive strategy of Eastern Europe, bankrupting his treasury to build dozens of massive, thick-walled stone castles on high ground. He knows he cannot defeat the Mongols in an open field, so he prepares to hide in the rocks like a cornered animal. The military mindset of Europe is also permanently scarred. The gleaming, heavily armored knight, once the undisputed lord of the battlefield, has been humiliatingly exposed as a slow, cumbersome relic. The European nobility realizes that brute force and expensive iron are utterly useless against speed, discipline, and advanced logistics. They begin to slowly adapt, recognizing the necessity of lighter cavalry, better scouting, and more flexible tactics. The arrogant illusion of Western military supremacy has been violently shattered, replaced by a cold, lingering sense of absolute vulnerability. The Mongol invasion of Europe was brief, but its shadow is long. It serves as a brutal historical reminder that geography is not an impenetrable shield, and civilization is not a guarantee of survival. The powers of the West were forced to look into the abyss and acknowledge that they were not the center of the universe. They were just a small, relatively primitive peninsula on the edge of a massive, interconnected Eurasian landmass. They survived the apocalypse not through their own brilliance, their expensive armor, or the grace of God, but through the unpredictable chaos of human biology and distant steppe politics. The phantom menace of the Golden Horde returning to finish the job will haunt the nightmares of popes and emperors for generations to come. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story of brutal survival and historical irony resonated with you, please destroy that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these forgotten stories reach more people. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think Europe would have eventually found a way to adapt and defeat Subutai? Or would the continent have been completely absorbed into the Mongol Empire? Let the debate begin below. If you want to understand what happened when another great empire faced an impossible enemy, click the video on your screen right now to see the brutal truth of the fall of Constantinople. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past, it's a warning for the future.